Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Point Blank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday live from East London. Today we're joined by Point Blank instructor Paul Ressel for a live performance special. So as I said, today we are excited to be joined by Point Blank instructor, artist and producer Paul Ressel, who's going to show you how to make the most of Korg's new Volca sample and Electribe in your live performances. And if you want to learn more about sampling, sound design, playing live and much more, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com, especially our sound design module. And remember, we are live and interactive, so stick your questions in the chat and we'll get to them throughout the broadcast. Paul, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday to you too.
Thank you.
Best day of the week.
Exactly. So maybe you could give us an introduction to what we've got here.
Yeah, of course. So we have two very different tools here. Firstly, starting with the Korg Volca sample, which is, it's kind of got the DNA of an old school kind of Akai, like the S1000 early samplers, very small sampling time, but a lot of kind of live manipulation that you can do with those samples and play around with them. The Electribe was what it says on the box. It's a music production studio, and the version that we're using here today has a bunch of built-in synthesizers, oscillators, drum hits, a whole bunch of different things that really allow you to sort of use it as a palette to come up with some really interesting song ideas.
Okay, cool.
So we should probably start off with is looking at getting samples onto the Volca sampler.
Yeah, because it's slightly unconventional, right? It's not.
Well, so what you have here is 4 megabytes of sampling time.
Ah, good.
Which anyone who remembers the 1980s and 1990s will be very familiar with. It's a very small amount of time. That's to get up to 100 samples onto it. So you've got to be very careful about the kind of samples you prepare, what's going to be the most useful to you, and you've got to be very good about cutting the transients in the right place. Right. So I thought I'd just show you quickly some of the samples. These are some bits that I started with, and these are parts that I cut up and then put onto the Korg Volca sampler. So just to kind of start off here, I've got this sort of melodic ARP sound that I created using some other software. And basically what I was looking for is just something really short, because again, you're looking at between sort of 80 and 150K per sample size. Right. So it's got to be small. So just kind of finding an interesting bit. If we just take this little first bit over here. So that kind of gives you something you've got to think about when you're loading samples, how it's going to sound when you change its pitch. You can also, with the Volca sample, you can change its starting and ending position, so you can change the loop times. So just something that's got enough sort of tonal difference in it that's going to give you a lot of options, basically, because you have a very small amount of space. So once you've kind of picked the sample space that you want, just head to the fade tool. Really important that you make sure that your fades are nice and clean at the end, so you don't get clicks when the sample comes back. And the other thing you want to make sure of is that your transient at the beginning is good. Is just exactly in the right place. So when you trigger it, you're not waiting, a couple of milliseconds before it actually pops in. Okay, so once you've got your sound up, the important thing is when you export. So again, you're dealing with 4 megs, so you can't have luxurious things like stereo, for example. So what you need to do is make sure that you're converting your files when you export them to mono, and that you're making it 16-bit depth and 441 kilohertz sample size. And then, it's just a matter of saving it. And once it comes down, you end up with a sample size that's tiny compared to the original. That's looking at 180K. And even for the Korg, that's quite a big file. Like a lot of the ones I have, like kicks and snares and those kind of things, those are really tiny. Like there's a snare in there that's I think 6K or something. So really, really small.
You could go below 44.1, I guess.
You could, yeah. You could go down sample size, but the nice thing about it is you don't really have to. I mean, this can output at 441, so it's definitely worth using that extra sample rate. Okay, so once you've kind of prepared your samples and you've got them all loaded up, there is a iPhone app called the Audio Pocket, which was basically Korg brought up to allow you to get files off your computer onto the Volca sample. So the way it works is you, through iTunes, when your phone's plugged in, you basically load your sounds onto it, and then literally connect it through a sync connector and play the files off onto the Korg sampler.
So play them in real time?
Well, it sort of loads them in as close to real time as possible, yeah.
Okay.
It's quite an old school solution because it's actually, I mean, using your headphone output to basically connect the two. So it's almost like an old school CV connection that you used to get on modular synths and those kind of things. So yeah, so once you've got your 4 megs of samples loaded up, it's really just to go ahead and have a play with it.
Yeah. So is it, I mean, considering it's only 4 meg, is it feasible that you could do a full live show with it? Or would it have
With
to
just this, you could. I think you definitely could. Because
challenge accepted.
Yeah, challenge definitely accepted. I think what Korg's kind of struck gold with the Volca sample is that it's really fun. It's really fun to kind of play around with, and the ways you can kind of manipulate the samples as you kind of go through your productions and sort of put them together. It gives you a very wide variety of options in terms of actual production, and there's lots of ways to kind of bring parts out and bring parts in. I mean, there are other limitations as well. You've only got a 16-step sequencer, which could be a limitation, but it just depends how you look at things, you know? It could be a strength as well. Yeah. So I like those limitations. They kind of force you to work in a very specific sort of way. And I think these two units together are really kind of interesting.
Cool. Shall we hear the sample?
Yeah, so I've got a whole bunch of these are all my own samples that I've loaded on here. I love working with vocal samples. I just think you can do some really interesting things with it. So I'll just put a little idea together here quickly. So basically what I've got at the moment, I've got the Electribe is synced to the Volca sample. So if we just start getting a basic drum beat down, they're kind of already synced together, and I know I can just start putting ideas down in the sample, and it's going to work. So let's get this kind of where I want it. Okay. Kind of have your samples like loaded in. It's really easy to sort of keep like adding bits as you go, so you can kind of start building things over with layers. So get a bit more of a beat going together. So it's sort of pre-programmed in the Electribe. And also there's this great function on the Korg Volca that allows you to just kind of loop little parts as well. So there's a whole bunch of other things like you have the step mode as well. So if I had to bring in sort of another little section here, let's go. But this really interesting thing called step mode, where you can basically reposition the material on live as you go. Both these units actually have the same thing, so you can kind of really get your performance like into it, just from playing around with those sort of ideas. Let me show you a couple of other cool things you can do just with the sampler. So I was just showing you that loop mode, but let me just show you a little bit more detail about how that kind of works. So to get it playing, okay, so just get this like basic loop. So it's got this really interesting little loop mode, which allows you to, it just loops the sample. So it doesn't care how long the sample is. The minute you reach the end of it, it'll just start looping it again. And you can sort of really get that like racy sort of sound by changing the length of the sample like over time. You get these like really interesting sort of effects with that. And all that stuff is motion controlled, so you can record that in. And it just remembers like what you've done, which is really nice sometimes. And you can still change all the other parameters as well. So you can do something really interesting sort of sample mangling, like just with this. And then what you have, I'll just stop that for the moment. And then what you've got with the Electribe, besides having sort of hands-on functionality with everything that's going on here, so you've got access to things like filters. So if I just start, let's just drop some of these parts out now. So just get most of the kind of percussion stuff working. You've got this XY pad which you can use for effects. So you can kind of really sort of bring interesting effects in, like as you go, just sort of play off the XY pads. You can also individually edit each part as you go. There are built-in filters which allow you kind of like change the shape. So everything's kind of hands-on. It's all contextual. The minute you change from one sample to another, you can really start like getting hands-on with it and just like get into it. And the great thing about stuff like this is that the music never has to stop. Music never has to stop. You know, you can just keep going, and it's a really beautiful way of like producing and performing kind of at the same time. So I'll show you a couple of other things. So like I was saying, there's basically this XY pad, which allows you to do quite a lot of things with the sort of built-in effects that you get on the Electribe. You can also touch play different parts. So depending on like what instrument you currently have sort of loaded. So if I took, say, one of the bass sound, for example. So while other stuff's going on, you can kind of play it. You can use it as an arpeggiator as well. A little bit like, yeah, exactly. Like there's a lot of that DNA in here as well. And it's really, it's pressure sensitive, and it's obviously position sensitive as well. So you've got almost like 3 dimensions of parameters you can control just by how you play with that. But the best thing about both these units is when you actually sync them together. So Korg have got this new system now with a lot of their, obviously started with the Volca products going into the Electribe now, where they use the same connector you use to download samples onto the Volca sample. So it's just basically it's a headphone connector, basic sort of CV connector. And it allows you to sync multiple Korg units together. And the sync is fantastic. I mean, you know, having years of experience doing live performances with electronic gear, sync is always the biggest nightmare because you're dealing with MIDI and you can't trust MIDI. Yeah. So this is actually a fantastic system, and so as far as I can tell, it's pretty flawless. Like everything kind of locks in perfectly in place. So you can kind of get your basic sort of patterns down on each idea, and then there's just so much room to play like as you go. So if I just kick this one off again from the top. somewhere with the grid, which is really good as well. Step function is just so good as well. Kind of like building in build-ups and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, you can literally just go on for hours and hours. It's really fun. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing. It just gets you. You just get really kind of like sort of involved in the process of it. And I think that's the strength of having something like this as opposed to doing all your work on a software-based interface. I mean, sure, you have things like Ableton Push and all the sort of native instruments hardware that you can use these days. But the great thing about this is that you're not relying on sort of the screen to show you the production you've already put together. You're using your ears the entire time, which is it's just really useful. And it kind of forces you to think about music as something that just kind of happens. The process is part of it. It's not about sitting and clicking a mouse for hours in a studio and then just hoping something's going to come up. So yeah, and I'm really happy to kind of see that this is sort of the way music production seems to be going these days.
Especially you see a lot of DJs bringing in some of the Volca stuff into their sets, and more people are moving towards live sequencing and creating things that only happen in that moment, and the next time they do it, it's something new and exciting.
It's something totally different, yeah. And I think that's spontaneity. I mean, that is performance, and it's really good to see that coming kind of back into electronic music.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's they're making the units cheaper. It's easier to come down. It's much easier for anyone. The Volca stuff is really well priced, and it sounds great.
Yeah,
it really does.
If you had to choose between, which one would you pick up?
I think if I was stretched, I'd probably go for the Volca sample, just because. I mean, this thing is also battery operated, but literally, since I've been playing around with this thing, whenever I have a spare moment, if I'm, sitting on the tube on the way home or whatever it is, I'll take out the Volca sample, just sit there with my headphones. It's really fun. It's a great tool to kind of play around with, and it sounds fantastic. I'd been playing with it with headphones for quite a while. I took it into my studio, put it on my speakers, and I was blown away actually by the quality of the audio output. So I think if I was told to pick, I would probably pick the Volca sample.
Yeah, cool, man. And of course, like we are actually giving away not the Volca sample, all 3 Volca beats, keys, and bass, and the new SQ1 Korg. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to win that. But yeah, so thanks, Paul. That was ace. So yeah, we are out of time for today's FFL, but if you want to learn a lot more about sampling, live performance, and sound design, make sure you check out pointblanklondon.com, especially our sound design module. We'll be back next Friday for another FFL, so we'll see you then. Cheers.